Melt Ganyu has been known as one of Genshin's highest DPS teams for a long time, with caveats of course, and simply performing a melted charge shot that does as much damage as a typical character's burst will let you see why. First off, introducing the team, the composition is rather inflexible. You have Ganyu, Zhongli as a shielder, or Diona, Yanfei, Xinyan, or Thoma otherwise, none of which offer the same uptime as Zhongli but can work as Copium options, and a Pyro duo consisting of Bennett for his unrivaled attack buff and self-pyro application, and a Pyro spreader, which will be either Xiangling, Kazuha, or Jean. People might recommend Shenhe instead of Zhongli, but if you've tried using Shenhe in floor 12, you know that you can only get half the charge shots off unless you have extremely good RNG from resetting, so even if you see bigger numbers, you lose DPS, so I don't recommend it unless you're tackling easier content or you're okay with resetting the Abyss for hours to get the perfect run, which I can perfectly empathize with. In this video, I'll go through rotations with all three Pyro spreaders, starting with the most straightforward one, the non-C4 Xiangling variant. Then I'll quickly talk about how C4 Xiangling changes things. Then I'll talk about the two Anemo versions which are played with exactly the same skill order, but with caveats I'll cover individually. For the Anemo variants, I'll show two skill rotations. They can be played in a straightforward non-shredded way, as well as a complicated cryo-shredded way, which can be further executed in a timing-dependent way, as well as a skillshot-dependent way. The Anemo variants have a lot more depth to discuss because you'll actually need to pay attention to elemental auras to execute them properly. I'll then end the video with an Abyss floor demonstration with a C0R1 prototype Crescent Ganyu and the Jean variant. If you already know how to do the regular Xiangling rotation, feel free to skip directly to the shredded Anemo variant at this timestamp because you're probably already familiar with the first two rotations. We start with the non-C4 version where Pyronado lasts for only 10 seconds. Start with Zhongli's shield, then use Bennett's skill, then burst, use Xiangling's skill and burst, then perform a skill, then charge shots with Ganyu at shotgun range, making sure that the enemy has pyro applied before every shot. Once Bennett's circle disappears, you can fire your fourth and last shot, then switch to Bennett, use your skill and absorb the energy, then swap to Xiangling, use Guoba and normal attacks to proc the Fav weapon, collect the energy, then swap to Zhongli to restart the rotation exactly 22 seconds in. So the full rotation looks like this. There are two phases to this rotation. The first is the attack phase where you must strictly follow this order, as well as an energy recharge phase, which you can partially skip if the enemies gave you enough energy. Note that you will only use Guoba on Xiangling's first way down on the first rotation. After that, you can start without it as he's not off cooldown. Don't use Zhongli's burst because it's a DPS loss, unless you really need the crowd control. And don't use Ganyu's burst because the cryo application might eat your pyro auras, preventing you from melting your charge shots. The reason why we use Ganyu's skill is to make the team slightly less energy deficient and to proc the Shimenawa's 4-piece set effect if you're using it, but it's not a necessary step otherwise and you can save time by not using it. Zhongli's shield is used to both protect Ganyu while she's trying to charge shot and provide a bit of resistance shred, but do still dodge as much as you can to prevent it from breaking early. Also try to position the pillar near your enemy so that you can proc the tenacity of the Millilith's attack buff. Now if you have C4 Xiangling, you can play a slightly lower tempo 26-second rotation instead, because Pyronado is extended by 4 seconds, giving you the ability to perform an extra 2 charge shots. The first steps are the same as before, but instead of 4 shots, you get 6 shots now. From my practical experience of hours playing this team, there is no noticeable difference in these two rotations' DPS. The variance between my runs seems less than that caused by enemy RNG, so just pick whichever is more comfy to you. I think I should also mention what charge shot cancel I'm doing. It's not a complicated animation cancel. The way I play Ganyu is to just dash after every charge shot and aim again. I do this because I'm on a controller and I can't find an easy way to do the standard aim cancel. You don't have to do this, but sometimes it will prevent you from having your last shot unmelted in the Jean and Kazuha variations. Now I'll talk about the build and investment floor recommendations for this team. This team comp is not beginner friendly because you're going to need more than one rotation to clear the hardest content unless you have whale level artifact characters and weapons, and that's where the energy recharge investment floor of this team begins to show itself. If you're fighting floor 9 to 11, this team does not have too high of an investment floor because you can easily get HP particles, but against floor 12, for this to become more worth running than a national team, a taser team, or a typical hyper carry team, you'll probably want a Bennett with at least 250% energy recharge using the Noblesse Oblige or Instructor's set, and your Xiangling will also require 220 to 250% ER and preferably a Favonius weapon with at least 50% crit rate using the Emblem of Severed Fate set. For each rotation, you only have 4 full-powered charge shots, and if you don't have the energy recharge to have your Bennett and your Pyro spreaders burst up after just 2 Bennett skills and 2 skills from the spreader and the Fav particles, you will spend more than 2/3 of your rotation batterying your Pyro duo rather than doing Ganyu's charge shots, and at that point, running a lower investment requirement meta team would be more worth it. For Zhongli, build as much HP as you can, use the Black Tassel or Homa, and try to use the Tenacity of the Militith set if you can. Also, the investment floor on Ganyu is pretty high. The recommended build is 4 Wanderers or 4 Shimenawas, but you can get away with a 2-piece variant of Blizzard Strayer, Wanderer's Troop, Gladiators or Shimenawas. If you can't get an artifact set with at least 50 to 70% crit rate and decent crit damage and elemental mastery, I recommend coming back to this team when you eventually get a good set. I think it's worth introducing this Copium move you can use when your Pyronado requires too much energy for you. Guoba is an excellent Pyro applicator, and you can perform a mini 3 melt shot combo when you don't have energy for Pyronado with just Guoba. You can do this to buy time if your Bennett and Xiangling just couldn't get enough energy. The Xiangling variant is by far the most comfortable Melt Ganyu variant, but if you have to use your Xiangling for Sukokomon or something on the other half, or you don't have her built, or you have a really strong Kazuha or Jean, then you can use the Kazuha or Sunfire Jean variants. For the Kazuha variants, the Pyro application comes from using Kazuha's burst while standing on Bennett's circle, which infuses it with self-applied Pyro, even if no enemies have Pyro applied. For the Sunfire Jean variants, by standing on top of Bennett's circle, you self-apply Pyro, but standing on Jean's circle will swirl that Pyro off of you every tick. So by standing on both circles at the same time, you will constantly spread Pyro to surrounding enemies. When using Jean, make sure you always stand in the intersection of the 2 circles, but for the Kazuha variant, you can technically stand outside the bubble and Pyro will continue to apply. But you still want to stand on the Bennett circle for the attack buff. Note that to keep this video brief, whenever I explain how to play a rotation with Jean, you can use the exact same skill order on Kazuha and vice versa, and they will still work. So for all 3 of the next rotations, just use whichever character you please, and I will cover the gameplay caveats for both. Once again, I will first talk about the Shredless variant, followed by the timing-dependent shredded variant, and finally the skill-shot-dependent shredded variant. We'll start with the basic variant, which I'll refer to as the Shredless variant, where Shred refers to resistance shred provided by the Viridescent Veneerer artifact set. This first rotation will not use it. If you aren't very well versed in Genshin yet, or you don't want to have to think about too many things, I would recommend you use this because it's the most straightforward way. You play this almost exactly the same way you would have played the Xiangling non-C4 variant, but I'll demonstrate it once for good measure. Start with Zhongli's shield, then use Bennett's skill, then burst, then use Kazuha's tap skill and burst, making sure that you are standing on top of Bennett's circle, then perform charge shots with Ganyu within the Kazuha slash, making sure that the enemy has Pyro before every shot. If they don't, wait for the Kazuha slash to proc Pyro before shooting. Once Kazuha's burst disappears, then switch to Bennett, use your skill and collect the energy, swap to Kazuha and use your skill and normal attacks to proc the Fav weapon, collect the energy, then swap back to Zhongli to restart the rotation 22 seconds in. This rotation is exactly the same as the non-C4 Xiangling variant, but I will mention things to take note of when using the Anemo units. When using Kazuha, you must not use Ganyu's skill because Kazuha's burst applies very weak Pyro and this skill will eat 1 melt shot. So if you're using the Kazuha variant, I actually don't recommend using the 4-piece Shimenawa set because it relies on your skill usage and might mess up your melts. The second is that Zhongli's pillar can actually eat your Pyro aura so that you can't melt with Ganyu. It doesn't happen every time, but it happens enough that I wouldn't position my pillar close to enemies for the tenacity buff just in case. As for the Jean variant, this is not a concern because her swirl application of Pyro is strong, so you can leave your pillar nearby for the tenacity buff, and using Ganyu's skill for the Shimenawa set is okay. Now I'll talk about the shredded variants of the Anemo rotations. This brings a DPS increase because of the resistance shred from the VV set, and in Kazuha's case, he provides a further damage buff. As I mentioned, there are 2 ways to play this, a timing dependent one as well as a skill shot dependent one, both of which will follow the same skill order but are played slightly differently. Note that this rotation is really a bit more convoluted. First, I'll show the timing dependent version, where there's timing precision involved. We start with Zhongli's shield, then we use Ganyu's skill followed by a charge shot, otherwise enemies will not have a lingering cryo aura because of the previous rotation. Use Bennett's burst, then use Kazuha's skill and burst which swirls cryo and infuses Pyro, then use 4 charge shots with Ganyu. Swap to Bennett to use his skill, absorb the particles, then use Kazuha's skill and catch the particles, then Bennett's skill one more time and catch the particles. Then the cycle repeats, usually with a lingering Pyro aura. Now when we zoom out, we can see that things are getting kind of complicated because it's easy to do a single rotation with Shred, but when you do multiple rotations, there's 2 considerations. The first is energy requirements. Your Bennett must pull off 2 skills every rotation, and your Kazuha must as well, to supply energy for their bursts. The second consideration is lingering auras. In this specific rotation, you must make sure there is a cryo aura before Bennett's burst so that he doesn't apply pyro, and an additional instance of cryo is applied by Ganyu's flower popping so that Kazuha's burst can swirl cryo and significantly boost Ganyu's damage. You cannot skip this first charge shot or Ganyu's flower pop timing will be messed up, and you must complete all of these steps and Kazuha's plunge before Ganyu's flower pops. You also need to press your skill immediately after swapping to Kazuha, or self-pyro will be applied and your plunge will apply pyro, removing the cryo aura without swirling it. By having this lingering cryo aura, Kazuha's burst can swirl cryo and infuse pyro. So make sure you do not delay landing this plunge, or you will find that you will not swirl cryo and your charge shots will do less damage. If you're using Jean instead, her skill is much faster than Kazuha's skill, so you might need to wait for a moment so that your burst only procs after the flower pops. If you use your burst before the flower pops, you will usually not swirl the cryo. To get around this, you can dilly-dally for a moment before using his burst. Sometimes the enemies will catch cryo and no amount of swirling can give them pyro, and at that point, you kind of have to reset. To avoid this, make sure the enemy has caught pyro before applying any of Ganyu's cryo. Note that this version is also a bit enemy RNG dependent because if enemies run away from your flower, there's nothing you can do to get the cryo swirl off. Of course, you don't really need the swirl, but you'll lose around 25% of your Ganyu's charge shot damage. Now this is really quite tricky to get, so if the timing does not seem to work for you, then you should try out the Skillshot dependent version, which I'll show next. This plays out very similarly. We start with Zhongli's shield, then we use Ganyu's skill, and you only need to charge shot if the enemy doesn't have a lingering cryo aura. Run backwards and make sure Bennett's burst doesn't eat the cryo aura. Follow this by running forward to use Jean's skill and burst, which swirls cryo. Then by standing in the intersection of Jean and Bennett's circles, pyro will continuously be swirled onto enemies near your character. Perform 4 charge shots with Ganyu. Swap to Bennett to use his skill, absorb the particles, then use Jean's skill and normal attacks to proc the Fav weapon and catch the particles. Then use Bennett's skill one more time and catch the particles, then the cycle repeats, usually with a lingering pyro aura. In this version, you don't have to time the popping of the flower, and you can cut out one usually unmelded charge shot, but the cost is that you need to perfectly place Bennett's burst. Remember that to infuse Kazuha's burst with pyro and still swirl the cryo, you need to cast it on top of Bennett's circle, and you need the enemy to be close enough to be within the burst. And for the Jean variant, you also need to make sure that the circle intersection is close enough to your enemies, so this requires a lot of practice. Of course, again, failing to swirl the cryo aura isn't the end of the world, it's just a 25%-ish DPS loss and you can get by without it. These are just things to keep in mind to maximize the rotation. Another thing to remember is that if you happen to have enough energy, skip these battery steps and you'll do a lot higher DPS. But in the boss stages of the Abyss, you usually don't have that luxury. Now, this is really quite a hard rotation and has a high failure rate, so just remember that in the heat of the moment, the Shredless version is also available. For build recommendations, if using Kazuha, his pyro application is weak, so it's not recommended for Ganyu to use the Shimenawa 4-piece set because her skill will eat the melt shots, but for Jean, it's fine. For Zhongli, the tenacity is still recommended, but for Kazuha, you probably can't use it to its fullest because the pillar will eat Kazuha's applied pyro, but for Jean, this isn't a concern. For Kazuha, you must use the VV set, and I recommend around 200% ER if you can, with the Favonia sword and at least 50% crit rate, and the rest of the stats should prioritize Elemental Mastery for a stronger elemental damage buff to Ganyu. If you can get away with less, you can trade some of that ER for EM to get a stronger buff. For Jean, just use the VV set with at least 220 to 250 ER and a Fav weapon with at least 50% crit rate if possible, and her other stats don't matter. Finally, here's a full demonstration of 12-2-1 with the Sunfire Jean Skillshot dependent variant. With that, I'll just let the run play out.
花と酒を手に景色を堪能しようとしたが。
And that's it for this Melt Ganyu guide. This team comp is often mentioned, but I've never seen a full rotation explanation out there for the Anemo variants, so I spent hours in the abyss playing these comps to figure out a way to play them smoothly, but if I've missed out anything, please share improvements in the comments below. So I hope you've learned something from this guide, and if you enjoyed it, please smash the like button, and if you'd like to see more of such rotation guides for specific team comps in the future, please consider subscribing. With that, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.